The French night is a wall of black ink. The year was 1944. Corporal Eddie Donald sits behind the wheel of a heavy cargo truck, feeling the engine vibrate through the soles of his boots. He is driving blind, guided only by the tiny red glow of the blackout lights on the vehicle ahead. Behind him, 5 tons of high-octane fuel and mortar shells bounce over the ruined road. Then, a new sound cuts through the drone of the convoy. It is the guttural growl of a German buzz bomb streaking through the low clouds. Suddenly, the engine overhead coughs and goes silent. In this war, that silence is a death sentence. It means the bomb has run out of fuel and is beginning its plunge to earth. Eddie has a split second to decide. He can dive for a ditch and leave his cargo to burn, or he can floor it into the dark. He slams his boot onto the accelerator. He prays the explosion finds the dirt behind his tailgate. As the orange blast lights up the countryside, a single question remains. What happens to a global superpower when the only thing standing between a total military collapse and the liberation of Europe is a 20-year-old behind the wheel of a truck that was never meant to leave the beach? How did a fleet of improvised vehicles, driven by men the army had branded second class, become the heart and lungs of the entire invasion? To find the answer, we have to look back to the moment the spring finally snapped. 2 months earlier, in the sweltering heat of July, the Allied advance was a bloody stalemate. The American army was trapped in the Normandy hedgerows. These were ancient earthen walls and sunken lanes where the air smelled of death and rifle fire. For weeks, the military was a coiled spring with nowhere to go. Mountains of crates and fuel cans sat useless on the beaches. The army was suffocating on its own supplies. On July 25th, the sky caught fire. A massive fleet of bombers erased the German lines and shattered the stalemate. The coiled spring didn't just release. It exploded. Led by General Patton's tanks, the American army transformed into a stampede. They covered 150 miles in just 2 weeks. It was a pace that no one had predicted, but this speed brought a terrifying new crisis. The French rail lines were twisted scrap metal. The great ports were still held by fanatical German garrisons. The tanks were winning the race, but they were running on fumes. They were burning a gallon of fuel for every single mile gained. The advance was outrunning its own heart. The military realized the war would not be won by a brilliant maneuver or a heavy tank. It would be won by whoever could bridge the gap between the beaches and the front. It was that simple and that desperate. By August of 1944, the map of France was a blur. Patton's tanks were tearing across the countryside so fast they were outrunning their own maps. For the first time in history, an army was moving faster than the ink could dry on its orders. But the victory felt like a trap. The American juggernaut was winning, but it was gasping for air. This was the birth of what some called the North American way. It was the realization that the war would be decided by the disposable abundance of the American truck. While the German infantry still relied on horse-drawn wagons, the United States arrived with a vehicle for every 4 soldiers. The truck was no longer a utility. It was a primary weapon. In a frantic headquarters, General John Lee stood over a map of the French interior. Lee was a man of rigid discipline, often called Jesus Christ himself by his frustrated peers. He saw the reports. Divisions were stalling because they were dry. The supply vacuum had become a terminal threat. Lee took a red grease pencil and carved a massive loop across the map. It was a one-way high-speed highway running from the ruins of the coast to the supply dumps near Paris. But the math didn't work. He had the trucks, but he was short by thousands of drivers. He issued an order that shocked the ranks. Thousands of infantrymen were told to drop their rifles and grab a steering wheel. By late August, the Red Ball Express was no longer just a plan. It was a 24-hour race against a ticking clock. To understand the terror of this transition, you have to stand in the pitch-black mud of a supply depot with a soldier like Philip Dick. One day he was an infantryman with a combat division. The next, he was shoved into the cab of a 2.5-ton truck and told to move. There was no training manual for the hollow, glazed expression that soldiers called the Aleutian stare. It was the look of a man who had been behind the wheel for 72 hours without sleep. Philip sat in the dark, his hands trembling as he tried to master the art of shifting gears by sound alone. The air was a heavy mix of exhaust and the scream of metal as thousands of new drivers fought to keep their loads moving. No headlights were allowed. Only tiny slits of light provided enough glow to see the tailgate of the truck 10 feet ahead. Philip felt the frame groan as the truck was loaded with twice its rated weight. He was not just driving a vehicle. He was piloting a 5-ton bomb through a landscape where a single wrong turn could lead him straight into a German tank division. The exhaustion felt like a physical weight on his eyelids. He watched as drivers in the trucks ahead performed a desperate dance, sliding across the seat while the vehicle was still moving to ensure the wheels never stopped. The mission had replaced military discipline with a raw, lawless urgency. Mechanics worked in the rain to bypass engine governors, allowing the trucks to roar at 60 miles per hour down narrow, shattered lanes. They were sacrificing the machines and the men for a single goal: tonnage. As the sun rose over a horizon flickering with artillery fire, Philip realized the glory of the breakout had been traded for the grinding labor of the road. Victory no longer looked like a flag over a city. It looked like a full jerrycan of fuel. While the drivers fought the road, the mechanics fought the machines. The air inside the repair depot is a thick soup of diesel and wet canvas. It is 3 o'clock in the morning. Master Sergeant Macready sits on a wooden crate, his hands so saturated with black oil that the grease has moved into his very pores. He lifts a cup of cold, bitter coffee. His fingers tremble with a vibration he can no longer control. Before him sits the skeletal remains of a 2.5-ton truck, its hood open like the mouth of a dead whale. Macready is the high priest of a mechanical graveyard. To his left, a pile of ruined tires reaches toward the rafters. To his right lies the guts of captured German transport. He looks at the intricate engine of a German half-track, a marvel of precision that required a clean room to maintain. In the mud of France, that precision was a death sentence. Macready spits into the dirt. The United States had not built a masterpiece. They had built a juggernaut of disposability. These trucks were designed to be driven until they screamed, wrecked in a ditch, and then stripped for parts. It was a philosophy of industrial attrition that the Germans could not fathom. The truck was a weapon that did not need to last. As Macready reaches back into the engine block, his mind drifts from the machines to the men. He thinks of the thousands of drivers out there in the haze of the highway. He can see them in his mind's eye. They are men who have been behind the wheel for 70 hours straight, their eyes fixed in that unblinking stare. They navigate by the hypnotic red lights of the truck ahead, their hearts hammering every time a shadow moves in the trees. But there is a bitter irony that Macready chews on as he fights a stubborn gasket. These men are the indispensable heart of the entire Allied war effort. 70% of them are African American. They are the ones carrying the fuel and shells to the very edge of the firing line. Yet, when they pull those trucks back into the depots, the democracy they are fueling turns its back on them. Macready has seen the separate mess halls and the clubs that slam their doors shut. He has seen white infantrymen who would starve without these supplies refuse to share a bench with the men who delivered them. They are fighting two wars at once. One is against the German army. The other is against a military that treats them as second class, even as it demands they perform the impossible. The scale of the mechanical collapse is finally beginning to mirror the human one. By the autumn of 1944, the supply line has reached its breaking point. Over 33,000 American trucks are currently rotting in depots because they lack a single spark plug or a set of bearings. The official maintenance plans have been tossed into the mud. The trucks are simply run until the engines seize or the axles snap. It is a reckless gamble that has left the army rattling against the limits of its own machinery. Macready picks up a heavy wrench and begins to tighten a bolt, his muscles screaming in protest. He knows that if he does not get this truck back on the road by dawn, a tank company 50 miles away will become nothing more than a collection of stationary targets. He leans his forehead against the cold metal of the fender. The rain outside intensifies into a roar that drowns out the world. There are no medals for the men who fight with grease guns in the middle of the night. There are no headlines for the soldiers who navigate the high explosive danger of the road with hearts full of disillusionment. But as the wrench finally turns and the bolt seats home with a metallic thud, Macready feels a solitary spark of pride. The world obsessed over the glamour of the front-line breakthrough. But Macready saw the truth in the oil on his hands. The war was not being won by a map. It was being won by a replacement part. By October of 1944, the supply line had transformed into a lawless frontier. The road was a 300-mile strip of motorized anarchy, where the standard rules of the army had been ground into the French mud. To understand this era, you have to climb into the cab with a driver like Philip Dick. By now, the exhaustion has moved past the bone and settled into the soul. The mechanical limiters meant to keep the trucks at a safe 35 miles per hour have been bypassed. Drivers now push their vehicles down narrow lanes at 60 miles per hour. The steering wheel vibrates with a violent shudder as Philip pushes 5 tons of ammunition through the shadows. The air inside the cab is a thick haze of diesel fumes and local brandy. It was a race with no rules. In this frantic relay, a shadow economy has taken root in the ditches. Gasoline has become the only currency that matters. A single can of fuel can fetch 5,000 francs on the black market. Philip watches as supplies vanish into the hands of civilians in exchange for a few hours of sleep in a real bed. The mission has entered a jagged ethical grey zone. Drivers carry pistols to protect their cargo from their own side. The military hierarchy has flattened into nothing. A private behind the wheel of a fuel truck has more power than a colonel in a stalled jeep. It was a logistical Wild West, and it was working. But as the calendar turned toward November, the summer dust was replaced by a soul-killing rain. The French countryside transformed into a primordial soup of mud and frozen ruts. A stretch of road known as Buzzbomb Alley became a gauntlet of psychological terror. This is where the pursuit without pause began to exact a terminal price. The trucks were literally falling apart at the seams. Eddie Donald navigates his convoy through a landscape that has become a graveyard of American machinery. The road is lined with wrecks featuring snapped axles and engines seized from a lack of grease. Mechanics are forced to cannibalize 3 trucks just to keep one moving. It was a desperate cycle of scavenging. The myth of a safe life in the rear echelon was shattered on a grey, drizzling afternoon. Eddie is white-knuckling his wheel when a German fighter bomber drops out of the low clouds. There is no warning. Cannon fire stitches a line of flame across the pavement. In his rearview mirror, Eddie sees the fuel truck behind him transform into a towering orange fireball. The heat is so intense it blisters the paint on his own vehicle. He didn't stop. He hears the screams of men caught in the inferno, but he floors the engine into the mist. This was no longer a delivery run. It was a frontline combat mission. A grim realization was beginning to sink in across the entire command. The army had outpaced its own heart. They were winning the war by murdering the very machines that made victory possible. The American way of disposable abundance had met its limit in the frozen interior of France. Victory was being bought on credit, and the bill was finally coming due. And still the question hung in the air. What happens when the only thing standing between collapse and liberation is a 20-year-old behind the wheel? As the first snows of December began to fall, the Red Ball Express reached its breaking point. Eddie Donald found himself back in the crosshairs. Now return with me to that narrow road outside of Chartres. Corporal Eddie Donald sat frozen as the engine of the flying bomb cut out directly overhead. The silence that followed was a sudden vacuum. For 3 heartbeats, the world held its breath. Then, the night was deleted by a wall of white-hot light. The shockwave arrived as a physical hammer that shattered the windshield and lifted the 5-ton truck clean off the pavement. Eddie felt the world spin into a kaleidoscope of black mud and fire as the vehicle rolled into a deep ditch. He came to rest at a jagged angle, with the smell of raw gasoline thick in his throat. His hands were still locked on the wheel. The truck was dead. Through the haze of smoke, a pair of headlights cut through the dark. A heavy recovery wrecker lurched to a halt at the edge of the crater. Master Sergeant Macready swung down from the cab into the knee-deep slurry of mud. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply unspooled a thick steel cable. Together, the 2 men worked in a silent choreography of sweat and steel. They spoke only in the language of torque and tension. With the winch groaning, they dragged the battered truck back onto the road. The radiator was twisted, and the glass was gone, but the cargo was intact. Eddie climbed back into the seat and kicked the starter. The engine coughed and settled into a familiar growl. He threw the truck into gear and drove toward the flickering horizon. He left the crater behind. 40 miles to the east, the supply line had finally run dry. At the edge of a rain-soaked forest, a line of Sherman tanks sat like iron headstones. Their engines were cold and their crews stood in the mud with the hollow look of defeated men. A division commander stood by the road with a face of pure fury. He was preparing the order to abandon his vehicles and retreat on foot. Then, through the mist, came a grinding roar. Eddie's truck led the way. It was a ghost of a vehicle with no windshield and a crumpled hood. Behind him stretched a long caravan of trucks, marked with red placards. Within minutes, the silence was replaced by the sound of fuel pouring into thirsty steel bellies. The tanks roared back to life. The vacuum was filled. The advance was no longer a dream on a map. The war was not won by a single tactical genius or a perfect tank. It was won because the military realized that the most powerful weapon on earth is a supply line that refuses to stop. It was kept alive by the very men the nation had tried to ignore. It was that simple, but the victory of the road had a final, quiet chapter to write. As the winter of 1944 descended, the German army launched its last gamble in the Ardennes. The wall of segregation began to crumble under the weight of necessity. In the freezing dark, the army asked for black volunteers to pick up rifles and join the infantry. Over 4,000 men stepped forward. Many were veterans of the Red Ball Express who had spent months dodging bombs on the road. They traded their steering wheels for rifles. This was the first real crack in a century of institutional walls. It was a quiet defiance born in the mud. Today, if you drive the quiet secondary roads of France, the roar of the trucks is long gone. The highway is just a strip of pavement flanked by swaying wheat and stone farmhouses. But every so often, in the corner of a forgotten field, you might see a rusted shape half buried in the earth. It is a discarded cargo truck with a twisted frame and a hollow engine. It now serves as a trellis for wild vines and summer flowers. It stands as a silent monument to an unglamorous miracle. The generals drew the arrows on the maps, but the drivers made sure those arrows reached the heart of the enemy. The war ended with the quiet ticking of a cooling engine. And so, we have the answer to the question of what happens to a superpower when its survival depends on a 20-year-old behind the wheel. The answer is that the nation survives because those men refused to stop driving. They turned a desperate gamble into a motorized miracle. If your father or grandfather was one of the men who kept the supplies moving in 1944, I would be honored to hear his story. Tell us about his unit, his truck, or the roads he traveled in the comments below. We must keep these memories alive. There are many more stories to tell.